The year was 1832, and the quiet countryside of Ohio seemed untouched by the wider turbulence of the young nation. Rolling fields stretched as far as the eye could see, dotted with weathered barns and small wooden farmhouses that leaned against the winds of hard winters. Life here was marked by simplicity and hardship, where families relied on the soil, their neighbors, and their faith. Yet beneath the surface of this seemingly peaceful community, one tragic evening would leave scars too deep to heal, and questions that lingered for generations. It began with a stew, a family supper that turned into a nightmare, and the chilling mystery of why a mother and her sons never saw the dawn again. If you want to uncover more forgotten tragedies like this one, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the stories that history almost buried. The tragedy centered on the Green family, who lived on a modest farmstead just beyond the edge of town. Martha Green, a widow in her late 30s, was known for her resilience and her determination to keep her small household afloat after her husband's death. She raised her two sons, Samuel, 15, and Thomas, 12, with firm kindness, teaching them to work the fields and to respect the Sabbath with the same devotion. The family had no luxuries, but they carried themselves with dignity, never asking for more than what the land and their labor could provide. To Sheriff Elias Turner, the Green family had always represented the spirit of the countryside. A tall, broad-shouldered man in his early 40s, Elias had served as sheriff of the county for nearly a decade. He was known for his fairness and his patience, qualities that earned him respect in a community where suspicion and grudges often ran deep. He believed in order, but also in compassion, and it was this balance that guided his every decision. When word reached him that Martha and her sons had died suddenly after sharing a pot of stew, Elias felt an unease that no experience in his career had ever prepared him for. Death was not uncommon in rural Ohio. Illness, harsh winters, and farm accidents claimed many lives, but the whispers that followed the Green tragedy were different. The stew had not only killed, it had seemed to poison, and with every retelling the story grew darker. Neighbors spoke of sudden illness, of Martha collapsing before her children, of Samuel gasping for air as his younger brother cried out in confusion. Some claimed others at the table had suffered too, though not all fatally. The details shifted with every account, but one fact could not be denied. The Green home had gone silent, its hearth cold, its family buried before the questions had been answered. As Elias rode out to the Green farmstead on the morning after the deaths, the autumn wind carried a sharpness that cut through his coat. The trees stood bare, their branches clawing at the grey sky. He knew the journey would test not only his resolve, but also the fragile trust of the townsfolk. For in this land, justice was not a matter of science or written law alone. It was bound by reputation, by faith, and by the fierce pride of families who guarded their secrets closely. Standing before the Green home, Elias felt a heaviness in his chest. He had walked these same fields many times before, stopping to greet Samuel as he carried water from the well, or exchanging words with Martha about the struggles of the harvest. Now the windows stared back at him like hollow eyes, and silence pressed against the walls that had once been filled with voices. He dismounted his horse and stepped toward the door, the crunch of frost beneath his boots the only sound in the air. There was work to be done, questions to ask, truth to uncover, but for the first time in his life as sheriff, Elias wondered if justice could truly be found in a place where grief and suspicion already threatened to poison more than stew. And so began a case that would test the boundaries of trust, morality, and the very soul of a community. The Green family had long been a fixture in the countryside of Ohio, their modest farm lying on a narrow stretch of land bordered by a creek and a patch of dense woods. The farm was not large, nor was it particularly fertile, but it sustained them through long years of toil. Martha Green, widowed for nearly 6 years, managed both the house and the land, with a determination that astonished her neighbors. Life as a single mother was unforgiving, yet she carried herself with quiet dignity, refusing to allow pity to define her. Her husband, Jonathan Green, had been a respected farmer until a fever took him one summer, leaving Martha to raise Samuel and Thomas alone. She leaned on no one more than necessary, and though many whispered she was too proud, others admired her for her resilience. When supplies were low, she stretched meals with ingenuity. When debts weighed heavily, she worked longer hours in the fields. To those who knew her best, Martha's strength was not stubbornness but survival itself. Samuel at 15 was tall for his age, his shoulders beginning to bear the shape of a man's. He had his father's sharp eyes and his mother's restless mind. Samuel often spoke of wanting more than farm life. He read whatever books he could borrow from Reverend Miller's small library, dreaming of study and travel. Though respectful of his mother, he sometimes pressed her with questions that revealed his hunger for a world beyond the farm. "Ma," he would say, his voice a mix of defiance and longing, "there has to be more than ploughing and sowing. I can feel it in my bones." Thomas, 3 years younger, was gentler, more rooted to the soil that gave them their bread. He adored his brother, often following him around the fields, but he also carried a deep devotion to Martha. He was quick with his hands, eager to mend tools, fetch water, or tend to the animals. Where Samuel questioned, Thomas simply accepted, finding comfort in the rhythm of their life together. "We've got all we need right here," he once told Samuel, while stacking wood for winter. "Maybe it ain't grand, but it's ours." The green home itself was small and weathered, built of timber and warmed by a stone hearth. The scent of wood smoke clung to its walls, and the sound of creaking boards echoed through its rooms with every step. Neighbors often remarked that the greenhouse felt welcoming, not because it was lavish, but because Martha filled it with hospitality. A warm loaf of bread, a pot of stew, or a kind word at the door, these were her offerings, and many remembered them long after they left. Yet beneath the surface of their humble life, challenges pressed heavily. The soil was thin in places, and yields were often poor. Martha bartered eggs, milk, and wool to make ends meet, sometimes postponing payments to merchants who grew increasingly impatient. Though she was respected, she was also whispered about. Some said she was too proud to remarry, others suggested she clung too tightly to her land when it might have been wiser to sell and move closer to town. Still, there were bonds of loyalty that kept her connected. Abigail Carter, her closest friend, often stopped by to help with sewing or to share gossip about church gatherings. Reverend Miller admired Martha's unwavering attendance at Sunday service, her head bowed in prayer despite the burdens she carried. Even those who envied her quiet strength could not deny her reputation as a woman of faith and fortitude. The Green boys were well known among the local children. Samuel sometimes clashed with others, his boldness mistaken for arrogance, while Thomas's kind-hearted nature earned him more friends. Together, they carried the Green name with both pride and tension, for in a small community, every word spoken and every action taken was remembered. What none could imagine was how swiftly this family's story would unravel, and how the questions left behind would divide the very neighbors who once shared bread at their table. It was a cold evening in late October when Martha Green decided to prepare a meal that would bring comfort to weary neighbors. The harvest season had left everyone exhausted, and though her own stores were modest, she believed in sharing what she had. A stew was simmering over the hearth, rich with beans, root vegetables, and herbs gathered from her garden. The scent filled the house, earthy and warm, promising nourishment after long days in the fields. Samuel and Thomas helped set the table, their laughter mingling with the crackle of firewood. Samuel teased his brother about spilling salt, while Thomas reminded him that their mother insisted on respect at the table. "Ma says we eat like gentlemen," Thomas said with a grin, placing spoons beside each wooden bowl. Martha smiled at them, brushing her hands against her apron. "And I expect both of you to mind your manners tonight. We don't host often, but when we do it properly." Her voice carried that familiar mix of tenderness and firmness, a tone that left no room for argument. That night, a few neighbors joined them, simple folks who had come to exchange news, offer help with winter preparations, or merely enjoy the comfort of company. The Green home was small, but Martha's hospitality made it feel larger. The bowls were filled, steam rising in clouds, the smell of herbs and slow-cooked broth filling every corner of the room. At first, the gathering was cheerful. Samuel spoke eagerly about a pamphlet he had borrowed from Reverend Miller, describing distant cities and ideas beyond their fields. One guest chuckled and said, "Boy, you'll be dreaming your way clear to Boston before the year is through." Martha shook her head gently, but her eyes revealed quiet pride. Thomas, quieter than his brother, focused on his stew, nodding politely when spoken to. "This is real fine, Ma," he said between spoonfuls. "Best batch yet." Martha touched his shoulder affectionately. "Thank you, son. It's nothing fancy, but it'll warm our bones." But as the evening wore on, the warmth of the stew gave way to unease. A guest shifted in his chair, pale beneath the lamplight. Another clutched her stomach, groaning softly. At first, it seemed no more than fatigue from long labor, yet soon the symptoms worsened. Samuel dropped his spoon, pressing his hand to his mouth. Thomas's face drained of color as he leaned against the table, whispering, "Ma, I don't feel right." Panic spread swiftly. Martha rose, her eyes darting between her sons and the guests. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice trembling for the first time that evening. A neighbor staggered from his seat, collapsing near the door. Samuel tried to stand but fell back, his breath shallow and broken. Thomas clung to his mother, tears streaming down his cheeks. The room turned chaotic, groans, cries, the scrape of chairs against the floor. Some rushed outside into the bitter night, desperate for air. Others fell where they stood. Martha struggled to hold both her sons, her heart pounding as fear overtook her reason. "Stay with me," she begged, her voice breaking. "Stay with me, please." But her strength could not shield them. Within hours, the green home, once filled with laughter, fell silent. The hearth still glowed, but no warmth remained. The mother and her 2 sons were gone, their lives extinguished by a meal meant to bring comfort. The following morning, word spread like wildfire across the countryside. Farmers abandoned their fields, wives whispered at wells, and children were kept close to home. No one could understand how a stew, a simple dish of beans and herbs, could steal so many breaths in one night. Some spoke of spoiled food, others of cursed plants hidden in Martha's garden. A darker few whispered of deliberate poison. No answer came that day, only grief and suspicion. And from that night onward, the green home would never again be spoken of with ease. Sheriff Elias Turner had seen hardship before: barn fires, disputes over land, the occasional brawl after too much whiskey at the tavern, but nothing had prepared him for the silence that settled over the green homestead after the poisoned stew. Death was not new to him, yet this was different. It wasn't illness that crept in quietly, nor the predictable toll of winter's grip. It was sudden, shocking, and inexplicable. A mother and her sons were gone, and whispers of foul play rippled through the countryside. Elias knew his duty, but the weight of it pressed heavily on his shoulders. Riding back into town after surveying the green home, he could feel eyes following him. Men paused in their fields, leaning on hoes and shovels, while women at their porches hushed their children mid-sentence. Everyone wanted answers, but no one wanted to face what those answers might reveal. That evening, at the small office he kept near the courthouse, Elias sat with his deputy, a young man named Matthew Cole. Matthew was loyal, though still untested in matters that went beyond chasing down thieves or settling disputes over livestock. His brow furrowed as Elias spoke. "3 souls gone in a single night," Elias said, his voice low. "And others taken ill, but lived. I need to know if it was accident or intent. The town's already drawing its own conclusions." Matthew shifted uneasily. "Some folks are saying Martha herself did it, that she cooked with the wrong herbs, maybe belladonna or something like it. You know how gossip runs." Elias leaned back, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "I've heard. But Martha was no fool. She knew her garden better than most men know their land. I can't take rumor for truth. If I start down that road, we'll lose ourselves in suspicion." Yet even as he spoke, doubt crept into his own mind. The tools available to him were meager. There were no laboratories to test the food, no physicians with knowledge beyond what herbs to apply for fever. All he had was testimony, memory, and the courage to push against those who might prefer silence. The burden grew heavier the next morning, when townsfolk gathered at the churchyard to discuss the tragedy. Voices rose in agitation, demanding swift action. Silas Ward, a farmer with a sharp tongue and little patience for lawmen, shouted, "If it was poison, then someone's to blame, Sheriff." Are you going to act or let us live in fear of sharing a meal? Elias held his ground, though he felt the pressure of every gaze. I'll act when I have truth, not just talk. If I condemn a neighbor without proof, I'll bring more harm than justice. The crowd murmured, some approving, others restless. Abigail Carter, standing near the back, called out, "Sheriff's right. Martha was a good woman." "Don't speak ill of the dead until you know the facts." But Silas sneered. "Good woman or not, people died. You want us to sit quiet while poison brews in our kitchens." Elias could see how quickly fear turned into anger. He left the gathering with his resolve firm but his heart uneasy. Alone later that night, he sat by his desk with a single candle burning low. The air smelled of tallow and smoke, and outside a restless wind rattled the shutters. He thought of Martha's worn hands, of Samuel's restless ambitions, of Thomas's quiet devotion. He thought of their empty chairs, now cold. Justice demanded answers, yet truth seemed as elusive as smoke in the autumn air. And as Elias prepared himself to press deeper into the tangled web of grief and rumor, he understood that his role would not only be to uncover what had happened, but to hold a fragile community together before fear tore it apart. The days following the Green tragedy were marked by silence and suspicion. The once familiar rhythms of farm life seemed broken. Conversations at the well stopped abruptly when strangers approached, and every creak of a door or whisper of wind carried unease. Sheriff Elias Turner knew this was the most dangerous moment, not the night of the stew itself, but the aftermath when fear searched desperately for someone to blame. He began his inquiry with what remained of the food. The pot of stew, left half full on the hearth, was cold and congealed. Elias studied the mixture of beans, onions, and herbs, trying to detect with his eyes or nose what science could not yet reveal. He carried a spoonful carefully, though he dared not taste it. Among the herbs he recognized familiar sprigs of sage and thyme. But there was something else, small dark leaves that bore resemblance to nightshade, a plant well known in these parts for its deadly properties if prepared carelessly. Matthew Cole, his young deputy, shifted uncomfortably as he watched. "Could be she mixed the wrong greens, Sheriff. People say belladonna grows near her garden patch. Maybe she plucked the wrong ones without knowing." Elias frowned. Martha knew her herbs. She'd used them for years to treat fever and pain. If there's poison here, it didn't come from ignorance. He paused, his gaze heavy on the pot. Still, people will want the simplest answer, and that answer points to her. And indeed, rumors had already begun. At the mill, men spoke in hushed voices of Martha's stubbornness, claiming she might have grown reckless. At church, women exchanged uneasy glances, suggesting that grief or desperation had driven her to madness. Even in the schoolhouse, Samuel's classmates whispered that perhaps their own supper tables were no longer safe. One afternoon, Elias visited Abigail Carter, Martha's closest friend, to seek her perspective. Her face was pale with sorrow, but her words were steady. Martha would never harm her children, she insisted. She guarded them fiercely even when others said she was too stern. I've seen her measure herbs with care, never rushing, never careless. Anyone who says otherwise didn't know her. I believe you, Elias replied softly, though the weight of doubt pressed against him. But belief won't quiet the town. They need something solid, and right now all they see is a pot of poisoned stew. Abigail's eyes shone with unshed tears. Then you must find what they cannot see. If you don't, Martha's name will be buried under lies. The sheriff carried those words with him as he continued his search. He questioned the surviving guests, their faces pale and drawn from their sickness. One claimed the stew had tasted bitter, though others insisted it was no different than usual. A woman whispered that she'd seen Samuel tending the garden days before, pulling plants she didn't recognize. Another swore she had heard Martha argue with Silas Ward about a boundary fence the week prior. Each testimony contradicted the next, and with every answer came more questions. Elias's nights grew restless. He found himself staring into the flame of his lantern, wondering if truth itself was slipping through his hands. One evening, Matthew asked him quietly, "Sheriff, what if the town's right? What if Martha did it, whether by mistake or by choice?" Elias looked hard at the young deputy, his jaw tightening. "Then we'd have to bear that truth." But I'll not call it so without proof. To accuse the dead without evidence is to poison more than stew. It poisons trust, and once that's gone, we'll never get it back. Still, the shadows lengthened over the green farm, and with each passing day, the line between rumor and fact blurred. Elias knew that if he didn't find clarity soon, suspicion itself might destroy the fragile bonds that held the community together. As the shock of the Green family's death spread, Elias Turner found himself caught in a web of neighborly voices, each one insisting on its own truth. The countryside was no longer just quiet fields and creaking barns. It was a hive of whispers, accusations and defenses that painted the Green story in every shade but clarity. His first stop was Reverend Jonah Miller's parsonage. The old preacher greeted him at the door, his face lined with concern. "Sheriff," he said, ushering him inside, "I've prayed for guidance, but the town is restless." Half believe Martha was careless with her herbs. The other half are ready to declare her a victim of wickedness. It's splitting us down the middle. Elias sat heavily in a wooden chair. "And what do you believe, Reverend?" Miller clasped his hands, his gaze steady. "I knew Martha well. She feared God and loved her children. I cannot accept she would bring this upon them. But I also cannot deny that death came from her own table. If she is innocent, then someone else bears guilt, and that thought chills me even more." Leaving the parsonage, Elias turned toward the Carter homestead. Abigail Carter met him at the fence, her apron dusted with flour, her expression grim. "They're saying all manner of things in town, Sheriff. Some even claim Martha wanted to be free of her debts, as though she'd poison her own boys for money. It's vile talk." "Rumor has a way of feeding itself," Elias said. "What I need is truth. Did you ever see anything strange at her home? Any sign she was troubled?" Abigail's eyes flashed. "Troubled by hardship, yes. By loneliness, yes. But not by malice. Martha had faults like anyone, but she would sooner starve than harm Samuel or Thomas. If you let them brand her a poisoner, you'll be burying her twice." Her words stayed with him as he walked back toward town, only to cross paths with Silas Ward, the Greens' longtime rival. Silas leaned against his fence post, arms folded, a smirk curling at his lips. "Sheriff," he drawled, "you're wasting your time chasing shadows. Everyone knows Martha was proud and stubborn. Maybe she thought she knew more than she did, plucking herbs she couldn't handle. Folk like that bring their own ruin." Elias met his gaze sharply. "Careful, Ward. Pride is one thing, murder is another." Silas shrugged, though his eyes glinted with satisfaction. "Say what you like. But you won't find me grieving. She fought me tooth and nail over every inch of that boundary line. Maybe the Lord judged it better than the law could." The sheriff felt anger rise, but held it back. He knew Silas's words would spread like fire in dry grass, fueling those eager to believe Martha's death was her own fault. Yet he also knew there were others like Abigail, willing to defend her memory at any cost. By the week's end, the town itself seemed divided into factions. At the general store, some shook their heads and muttered that Martha had been reckless. At the church, others declared her a victim, her honor worth protecting even in death. Children repeated fragments of what their parents whispered at home, their games turning dark as they played at poison stew in the fields. Elias stood at the crossroads of it all, hearing the voices, weighing each word, and feeling the strain pull at his resolve. To follow every rumor was to drown in them, yet to ignore them entirely was to risk missing the truth hidden among lies. As he mounted his horse one gray afternoon, the sky low and heavy with clouds, Elias knew the investigation was no longer just about the stew. It was about loyalty, rivalry, and the fragile bonds of a community that could either hold together or tear itself apart. And he understood that the deeper he pressed, the more those bonds would be tested. In the days that followed, Elias found his thoughts turning not only to Martha, but also to her two sons, whose short lives had left faint but telling imprints on the community. If the stew had claimed them as victims, then perhaps understanding their struggles might reveal whether the family had enemies or secrets that could explain the tragedy. He began with Samuel, whose restless spirit was no secret in town. Reverend Miller told Elias, "That boy had ambition, He'd sit in my study for hours, reading pamphlets and books he barely understood, asking questions most grown men never bothered with. He wasn't content with farming, he wanted more. Elias leaned forward. Did he ever say what he meant by more? The Reverend sighed. Boston, Philadelphia, maybe even beyond. He spoke of schools and libraries, of men debating ideas in places he could hardly imagine. But ambition like that is dangerous in these parts. It makes neighbors uneasy when a boy speaks as though he's too good for the soil that feeds him. The sheriff nodded, recalling how Samuel's boldness sometimes spilled into arrogance. At the mill, one worker had scoffed, "That Green boy thought he was destined for something higher. Always had his nose in a book, acting like the rest of us were simpletons." Resentment clung to those words, suggesting Samuel's dreams had not only set him apart, but also made him a target of envy. Thomas, however, was different. Where Samuel dreamed, Thomas stayed grounded. Abigail Carter described him with fondness. He was gentle, Sheriff, always helping his mother without being asked. He mended tools for neighbors, fetched water when others were tired. If ever a boy had a kind heart, it was Thomas. Elias listened, but he also sensed unspoken weight in her voice. "Did he ever seem troubled?" he asked. Abigail hesitated. Only when his brother quarreled with her. Samuel's tongue was sharp. Martha tried to guide him, but their arguments grew louder these past months. Thomas often stepped between them, pleading for peace. I worried that the strain might break them apart. Later, searching through the green home, Elias discovered a small bundle of letters tucked inside Samuel's wooden chest. The handwriting was careful, though uneven, revealing his youth. One letter spoke of leaving Ohio to study, another of frustration with small minds who mocked him. Most unsettling was a fragment where Samuel hinted that someone had warned him to stop asking questions about matters that don't concern a boy. Elias folded the letters with care, his mind racing. Who would threaten a 15-year-old for speaking his mind? And why? The sheriff also learned of tensions at the schoolhouse. A neighbor recalled hearing Samuel boast that he would inherit his mother's land and make it worth more than the fields of men twice his age. He wasn't afraid to speak his mind, the neighbor said bitterly. Made enemies faster than friends. And Thomas, poor boy, always trailed behind, trying to smooth things over. The contrast between the brothers became clear. One reaching outward, the other holding fast to home. And yet both, in their own ways, were vulnerable. Samuel's boldness invited resentment, while Thomas's loyalty tied him to every burden Martha carried. As Elias walked away from the green farmstead that evening, the sky streaked with the last light of day, he felt the weight of their unfinished stories pressing against his chest. Whatever had happened at that table was not merely about food or herbs, it was about a family caught between dreams and survival, admired by some, envied by others, and perhaps threatened by both. And so the question deepened. Had the stew been a tragic mistake, or the final blow in struggles that had begun long before that fateful night? Elias Turner had long understood that money, or the lack of it, could drive men to desperate acts. In rural Ohio, debts often lingered like storm clouds threatening to break at any moment. As he delved deeper into the Green family's affairs, he began to see how financial burdens might have woven themselves into the tragedy. At the general store, Elias questioned Thomas Miller, the merchant who kept ledgers for half the county. Miller, a shrewd man with spectacles perched on the bridge of his nose, produced a thick book and ran his finger down the pages. Here it is, Martha Green. Owed me near $2 for flour and lamp oil. She always promised to pay, and she always meant it. But truth is, she was behind more than once. Was she desperate? Elias asked. Miller pursed his lips. Not desperate enough to cheat, but pride kept her from asking for mercy. I never pressed her hard. Still, I've heard she owed Ward for seed as well, and there were whispers she'd delayed payment on a loan from the Carters, though Abigail never spoke ill of her. In these parts, debts aren't just numbers, Sheriff. They carry grudges. Later that afternoon, Elias visited Abigail Carter to confirm. She nodded reluctantly when he raised the matter. It's true I lent her money, $5. when Samuel took sick last year. She insisted she'd pay me back after harvest. I never doubted her honesty, but she fretted over it constantly. It weighed on her, though she hid it well from most. Did anyone else know? Elias asked. Abigail's gaze darkened. Silas Ward knew. He's the sort who never forgets a coin owed to him. He taunted her more than once in public, calling her too proud to beg. I begged her to ignore him, but you know, Martha, she answered sharp, and Ward doesn't forgive insults. The sheriff left with his mind troubled. Debts might not kill on their own, but they sowed resentment, and resentment could fester into cruelty. He continued his inquiries, speaking with a blacksmith who had sharpened the green plough without pay, and a neighbor who claimed Martha had borrowed seed potatoes in spring. Most described her as honest but stretched thin. A few, however, muttered that she clung too fiercely to land she could not afford, land others might have worked better. That evening, Elias sat at his desk, reviewing scraps of information. By candlelight, he studied a legal document he had borrowed from the courthouse records. It confirmed that Jonathan Green's will had left the farm solely to Martha, bypassing distant kin. Such a decision, unusual at the time, may have angered relatives who believed they had a claim. Combined with Martha's debts, it created a picture of a woman both admired and envied, respected yet resented. Matthew Cole entered quietly, setting a cup of coffee before him. "You think someone killed her over money?" the deputy asked. Elias exhaled slowly. Money, land, pride, it all tangles together. Folks don't always kill for wealth alone. Sometimes they kill for the insult of being denied it. Matthew frowned. But the stew, Sheriff. How does debt find its way into a pot of stew? That, Elias said, staring at the flickering flame, is the question that keeps me awake at night. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters against the house. Elias could almost feel the weight of unseen hands pushing at him from every side. Neighbors, rivals, creditors, all tied somehow to Martha Green's fate. The shadows of debt were long and dark, and in them might lie the key to whether her death was accident, recklessness, or something far more deliberate. The town of Fairfield, once bound by the rhythm of farming and worship, now felt like a tinderbox waiting for a spark. Every word spoken about the Green case carried weight, and Elias Turner felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. Loyalty, once unquestioned among neighbors, was now a fragile thing, tested with every rumor and every doubt. At the tavern one evening, voices rose louder than the crackle of the fire. Farmers gathered with mugs of cider, debating Martha's fate as though they themselves sat on a jury. Elias entered quietly, but his presence hushed the room only for a moment before Silas Ward's voice cut through. "Sheriff, you keep saying you're searching for truth, but what truth can there be? Martha poisoned her own stew. Whether by carelessness or worse, the result's the same. You waste time digging for shadows while the town suffers." Elias's jaw tightened. Carelessness is not the same as malice, Ward. And if I condemn a woman without proof, then no one's name in this town is safe from suspicion. "Is that the justice you want?" A man at the far table spoke up, his voice trembling with anger. "What I want is safety for my children. How do we know another pot of poison won't be served at the next supper?" Murmurs of agreement spread, and Elias knew that fear was quickly overwhelming reason. He left the tavern unsettled, sensing that if he failed to uncover answers soon, the people might take judgment into their own hands. The next morning, Abigail Carter arrived at his office. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold, but her eyes burned with determination. "They're turning on her, Elias. I hear them in town, spitting on Martha's memory as though she was some careless fool. I can't stand by and watch them destroy her name." "I won't let them bury her under lies," Elias assured her, though his voice carried the strain of doubt. Abigail leaned forward. "Then you'll need to do more than listen to gossip. You'll need to stand against men like Ward even when the town sides with him. Can you bear that weight?" Elias met her gaze. "Justice isn't about siding with anyone. It's about standing where the truth is, no matter how lonely that place may be." Her shoulders softened, but her words remained sharp. "Then be ready, Sheriff, because you may find yourself standing alone." That warning rang true when Reverend Miller visited later that week. His tone was gentle, But his message was heavy. Elias, I fear your insistence on patience is costing you the trust of the people. They demand resolution. Faith weakens in uncertainty. Would you have me deliver a lie to calm them, Reverend? Elias asked. The Reverend shook his head slowly. No, but know this. A flock without answers begins to scatter, and once scattered, it may not return. The sheriff felt the burden deepen. His allies, Abigail with her fierce loyalty, the Reverend with his quiet faith, stood beside him, but the crowd pressed harder with each passing day. Even his deputy began to waver. Late one night, Matthew Cole spoke with uncharacteristic boldness. Sheriff, maybe the town's right. Maybe it was an accident and all this searching only stirs up more anger. Folks are losing patience. Elias stared at the young man, seeing not defiance but fear. If we settle for easy answers, Matthew, we do more harm than good. Justice isn't about speed. It's about truth, no matter how bitter it tastes. Yet even as he said it, Elias felt the sting of doubt. Could truth still be found, or had suspicion already poisoned it beyond recognition? As winter's chill deepened and loyalties strained, he realized that finding answers was no longer his only task. He would also have to keep his own community from tearing itself apart. The more Elias Turner listened to the voices of Fairfield, the more one name returned to him like an echo: Silas Ward. No one spoke his name directly in accusation, yet his shadow hung over every rumor. His long-standing quarrels with Martha Green, his sharp tongue, and his unyielding pride made him a figure people both feared and resented. If the tragedy had roots in malice, Elias could not ignore the possibility that Ward's hand was involved. On a grey morning, Elias rode out to Ward's farm. The land was broad and well kept, his fences tall and unbroken, his fields already turned for the winter. Silas stood near his barn, splitting wood with a rhythm that spoke of strength and stubbornness. He barely paused when Elias dismounted. "Sheriff," he said flatly, his axe sinking into the log, "I hear you've been sniffing around my name." Elias met his gaze. "Your name comes up because you quarreled with Martha often. Folks say you threatened her more than once." Ward chuckled bitterly. "I threatened lawsuits, not poison. She stole from me, Sheriff. Stole land when she stretched her fence too far. You think I'd kill a woman and her boys over a few feet of soil?" "I think you had reason to hate her," Elias replied evenly. "And hate can grow into darker things." Silas tossed his axe aside, stepping closer. His eyes burned with resentment. "Martha Green thought herself better than me. She never bowed, never admitted fault. That pride cost her plenty, but don't lay her stew at my feet. I may be hard, but I ain't a murderer." Elias studied him, searching for cracks in his composure. Yet Silas's face, though lined with anger, held no fear, no tremor of guilt. Still, the sheriff could not ignore the details that tied him closer to the case. In town, a woman whispered to Elias that Ward often kept poisonous plants on his property, using them to rid his fields of pests. Another man claimed to have overheard Ward boasting that Martha's debts would eventually drive her into the ground. These were not proofs, but they were threads, and Elias could not dismiss them. Later that day, he questioned Ward's wife, Ruth, a quiet woman with tired eyes. She admitted in a trembling voice that she had once seen her husband handle nightshade leaves near the barn. "He said it was for the rats," she told Elias, "but I never felt right about it." When Elias pressed further, Ruth shook her head, fear creeping into her voice. "I won't speak against my husband, Sheriff. You understand. But if you want the truth, you'd best look at what grows behind that barn." That evening, Elias returned under fading light, circling Ward's property. Sure enough, behind the barn, near a compost heap, he found clusters of dark-leaved plants, nightshade, unmistakable and dangerous. He crouched, touching the soil with his gloved hand, unease crawling up his spine. "Proof or not," Elias muttered to himself, "this ties him closer than I'd like." When he confronted Ward again, the man snarled, "You think a few weeds make me a killer? Go on then, Sheriff. Tell the town you've found your culprit. See how far that gets you when you've no evidence but dirt and leaves." Ward's defiance was bold, But Elias sensed more beneath it. Guilt? Fear? Or simply the pride of a man who refused to bend? The sheriff could not yet say. As he rode away in the growing dark, the chill in the air seemed sharper than before. The evidence was circumstantial, but the path ahead was clear. If Elias pressed further, the entire community would be forced to choose between believing the Green family's honor or condemning a powerful rival who still stood unbowed. The Sunday following Elias's discovery of Nightshade on Silas Ward's property, the town gathered at the church not only for worship, but for reckoning. The Green tragedy had become more than a matter of grief. It was a storm pulling neighbors against one another. By the time the hymn was finished and Reverend Miller stepped down from the pulpit, whispers had swelled into arguments, and arguments into shouts. "Ward's behind it, sure as day," a farmer declared loudly. "Everyone knows his quarrels with Martha. Poison on his land is no accident." Ward himself, standing tall among his supporters, shot back, "Poison grows wild all over this countryside. If you're set on making me the villain, you'll need more than weeds behind a barn. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. I had no hand in that stew." The crowd broke into factions, some nodding fiercely in his defense, others shouting accusations. Abigail Carter rose from her bench, her voice cutting through the clamor. "How dare you smear Martha's memory while the real danger walks among us? You all know she was careful. You know she loved those boys. Are you so quick to believe lies because they're easier than truth?" Elias stepped forward, his presence enough to still a few voices, though not all. "This is not a court," he said firmly. "And yet you sit here condemning or defending as though judgment rests in your hands. I will not allow this town to tear itself apart over rumor." From the back, a man called out, "Then where's your proof, Sheriff? We've heard your words, but we see no justice. Either act or admit you failed." The weight of those words settled on Elias's shoulders. He knew the people wanted certainty, a name to carry their anger, a verdict to silence their fears. But the truth was murky, clouded by contradictions and motives that refused to reveal themselves fully. Later that afternoon, Elias walked with Reverend Miller outside the churchyard. The autumn wind scattered dry leaves at their feet. "They're restless," the Reverend said quietly. "They'll demand blood soon, whether or not it's deserved." "I can't give them blood for the sake of peace," Elias answered. "Justice isn't a performance to calm a crowd." The Reverend placed a hand on his shoulder. "But if the crowd believes in nothing, they will make their own justice, and that is something you cannot control." As the week wore on, public opinion hardened into two camps. At the tavern and the mill, men spoke darkly of Ward's grudges, pointing to the Nightshade as undeniable proof. At the store and the schoolhouse, others argued Martha's own pride and debts had driven her into carelessness or despair, painting her as the architect of her family's end. Children mimicked their parents' divisions, shouting poisoner at one another in the fields, while women at the well clutched their shawls tighter, speaking in anxious tones. Fear had become a living thing in Fairfield, shaping every glance and every word. One evening, Elias met Abigail at her home. She looked worn, her voice heavy with both sorrow and anger. "Sheriff, if you don't stand against Ward, others will, and they won't stop at words. They'll drag him into the street if it comes to it." Elias nodded grimly. "And if I move too soon without proof, others will turn against me, claiming I destroyed an innocent man. Either way, the truth gets lost." Abigail's eyes filled with tears. "Then what will become of us all?" The sheriff had no answer. He left her home with the sound of her words echoing in his ears, and the image of a town standing at the edge of a cliff, ready to push itself into ruin. The Green tragedy had begun at a supper table, but now it threatened to consume an entire community, and Elias knew the coming days would decide whether Fairfield would survive its grief or destroy itself in the trial of public opinion. Elias Turner had grown used to walking in circles, asking the same questions, hearing the same rehearsed answers, but something within him refused to give in to despair. If truth was buried beneath rumor, then he would dig until his hands bled. It was in the smallest details, he reminded himself, that a case could turn. One such detail surfaced when he revisited the Green homestead. The house had been shuttered since the night of the tragedy, Yet Elias insisted on stepping inside once more. The hearth was cold, but the pot of stew remained, thickened and blackened with age. As he studied the pot, he noticed something peculiar about its rim, a faint residue darker than the broth itself clinging to the edges. Matthew Cole wrinkled his nose. "It's just spoiled food, Sheriff." "Maybe," Elias said, dipping a rag to collect the residue. "Or maybe someone tampered with it after Martha set it to cook." That thought stayed with him as he traced other threads. A neighbor recalled that Martha had borrowed a pot only days before the supper. "Ours was cracked," the woman explained. "She asked if she might use one of mine. I gave her the small iron pot. Never thought more of it until I heard what happened." Elias pressed further. "Was it cleaned before you lent it?" The woman frowned, uncertain. "I believe so. But who can say for sure?" The possibility chilled him. What if the poison had not come from Martha's hand at all, but from something hidden within the pot itself? Another clue came from Abigail Carter. One evening she sat with Elias near her hearth, the light of the fire flickering against her tired face. "I've remembered something, Sheriff," she said softly. "The night of the supper, I stopped by Martha's to deliver a jar of preserves. I saw Samuel near the table arguing with his mother. His voice was low, but I heard him say, 'You shouldn't have invited them.'" Elias leaned forward. "Invited who?" "I don't know," Abigail admitted. But his tone was sharp, as though he feared something. "Martha hushed him quickly when she saw me." The sheriff's thoughts raced. If Samuel had sensed danger that night, it might explain why he had seemed restless, why neighbors recalled his unease. But danger from whom? In the tavern days later, Elias overheard two men whispering about a conversation they had caught weeks before the tragedy. "Ward told Martha she'd regret crossing him," one said. "But I heard another voice, someone else warning her to mind her place. I can't recall who." Such fragments were maddening. Each pointed in a different direction, each hinting at something unseen. Elias scribbled notes late into the night, his candle burning low, his eyes heavy with fatigue. Matthew watched him one evening and said, "Sheriff, you're chasing ghosts. A pot, an argument, a threat. None of it proves who dropped poison in that stew." Elias looked up, his face lined with exhaustion. Maybe not, but all these pieces fit together somehow. It's like a quilt, torn, frayed, but if we stitch enough, the picture will show itself. He thought again of the borrowed pot, of Samuel's warning, of the nightshade behind Ward's barn. None stood alone as proof, yet together they formed a web too tangled to dismiss. As he closed his notebook, Elias felt a chill sweep through him. The truth was near, he could sense it, but near was not the same as certain. And certainty was the only weapon strong enough to silence the storm that threatened to consume Fairfield. The weight of scattered clues pressed harder upon Elias Turner until he could no longer ignore the name that rose above all others: Silas Ward. The time for quiet observation had passed. If Ward's guilt could not be proven, it at least had to be tested. Elias knew that only in confrontation might truth or falsehood reveal itself. He found Ward in town one afternoon, standing outside the blacksmith's shop, speaking too loudly, as if to remind everyone of his presence. The sight of Elias approaching silenced the crowd. "Ward," Elias called, his voice steady, "I've questions that can't wait." Ward smirked, his chin lifting defiantly. "You've been sniffing at my heels long enough, Sheriff. Out with it." Elias stepped closer, his eyes never leaving the man's. "I've spoken to neighbors who saw you threaten Martha. I've walked your land and found nightshade growing near your barn. And I've heard whispers that you said her debts would drive her into the ground. Do you deny any of it?" The crowd leaned in, breaths held. Ward's jaw tightened, though he forced a laugh. "Threats of lawsuits, not murder. Nightshade grows wild. You'll find it in a dozen fields. And words said in anger don't make a killer. Is this your evidence, Sheriff?" "Hearsay and weeds." Elias's voice rose, firm as an iron nail. "Then explain this. A pot borrowed days before the supper, a residue on its rim darker than broth. A boy heard warning his mother not to invite someone, and all these threads lead back to you." Ward's eyes flickered just for a moment, and Elias caught it, a crack in the mask. The crowd erupted in murmurs. "Lies," Ward spat. but his voice carried less certainty. "You've nothing but shadows. If I wanted her land, I'd take it through the courts, not by poison." Abigail Carter, who had lingered at the edge of the crowd, stepped forward. "You hated her, Silas. You made it plain to everyone. And now you stand here mocking the dead when her children lie in their graves." Her voice trembled with both fury and grief, and for the first time Ward faltered. He opened his mouth to reply, but no words came. Elias seized the moment. "I can't prove you poured poison into that stew, but I can prove you carried hate enough to wish harm." And sometimes, Ward, hate leaves its mark even when the hand denies the act. The silence that followed was heavy. Some townsfolk nodded grimly, convinced. Others looked uneasy, unwilling to condemn a man without clear proof. Ward, breathing hard, finally barked, "You've no case, Sheriff. You want me guilty because it suits the story. But I'll not bow to your accusations." With that, he shoved past the crowd and strode away, his pride wounded but unbroken. Later, in the quiet of his office, Elias sat with Reverend Miller and Abigail. The Reverend's voice was low. "You shook him today, Sheriff. Enough that even his friends doubt him." "But doubt isn't proof," Elias replied, rubbing his temples. "The law demands more than suspicion, and without it Ward walks free, his shadow darkening every home in this town." Abigail's eyes burned. "Then we must live with half-truths? With a name whispered but never judged?" Elias looked into the dying flame of his lantern. "Sometimes, Abigail, that's all justice can reach, close to the truth but never fully in its grasp." And though the confrontation had revealed more than Ward intended, it also left Fairfield with a deeper wound. The wound of knowing that guilt could linger in plain sight, yet never be bound by law. The Green family was laid to rest on a wind-bitten hillside overlooking their fields. The graves were marked by simple wooden crosses, no more than rough planks hammered together, but the silence that surrounded them carried more weight than any monument could. Abigail Carter stood among a handful of mourners, her shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders, tears frozen on her cheeks. Reverend Miller's words drifted into the cold air, promising peace in heaven, though no peace seemed near in Fairfield. Elias Turner watched from the edge of the small gathering, his hat held in his hands. He had buried men before, victims of fever and accident, but this felt different. The tragedy of the stew was not only a matter of death, but of suspicion, its poison spreading beyond the grave to stain the living. He saw it in the faces of the townsfolk. Some glared at Silas Ward, others cast doubtful glances at Martha's resting place, and a few avoided one another entirely, as if trust itself had died alongside the Greens. In the weeks that followed, Fairfield bore scars that no sermon or law could heal. Ward's reputation suffered, though he was never formally condemned. At the tavern, some avoided him altogether, their silence an unspoken verdict. Others rallied to his side, not because they trusted his innocence, but because they feared the alternative, that one of their own could strike so close to home with deliberate cruelty. Ward himself walked the streets with his head high, but the swagger in his step seemed forced, his pride a shield against a town that no longer welcomed him fully. For Martha, Samuel, and Thomas, remembrance was divided. Abigail kept their memory alive, telling stories of Martha's kindness and the boys' laughter, but others muttered that they had brought misfortune upon themselves. At church, the benches where they once sat remained empty, a silent reminder that faith did not shield them from fate. Elias carried the burden in his own way. Alone in his office at night, he replayed every detail, the residue on the pot, the whispers of threats, the glance of fear in Ward's eyes. Yet no matter how tightly he gripped those fragments, they refused to form a chain strong enough for judgment. He had come close to the truth, but close could not fill graves nor mend broken trust. One evening Matthew Cole sat across from him, his young face drawn with worry. "Sheriff, people are saying the case is done, that nothing more can be done." Elias looked at him with tired eyes. "The case is never done, Matthew. It lingers, like smoke after a fire. We may not see the flames, but we breathe the ash." Matthew hesitated. "Do you regret it? Not forcing the town to choose a side?" Elias leaned back, the chair creaking beneath him. "Regret? Every day. But forcing judgment without proof, would have left scars deeper than these. Sometimes the hardest thing is letting the truth remain just out of reach. Outside, the first snow began to fall, blanketing the fields in silence. Yet beneath the white lay the same divisions, the same unanswered questions. Children still whispered about poisoned stew, men still argued over debts and grudges, and women still prayed that their own tables might remain untouched by tragedy. The green story became a caution, a shadow lingering in every supper shared. And though time would soften its edges, Elias knew it would never vanish completely. Some wounds once opened do not heal. They settle into the memory of a place, shaping the way people speak, the way they trust, the way they look at one another when the nights grow long. Fairfield would endure, but it would never again be whole. Winter deepened across the Ohio countryside, the snow lying heavy on barns and fields, muffling the sounds of life in Fairfield. For most, the green tragedy was something spoken of in lowered voices, a story to warn children not to stray too far, not to trust too quickly. But for Elias Turner it remained a constant companion, a case that never truly closed. Sitting alone in his office one late evening, he stared at the notebook filled with fragments, testimonies, rumors, half-formed truths. He had carried them like stones in his pocket, heavy and unyielding. "So close," he muttered, his breath misting in the cold air. So close, yet never certain. Reverend Miller had once told him that faith meant living with unanswered questions, but Elias was no preacher. He was a sheriff, sworn to uncover truth, not to rest content with mysteries. And yet here he sat, his duty fulfilled only halfway. He thought often of Martha, her proud stance in the churchyard, her hands red from labor, her steady gaze when men tried to belittle her. He thought of Samuel, his restless dreams tugging him toward a world beyond the farm, and Thomas, who never strayed far from his mother's side. They were gone, and the town could not even agree on how to remember them. To some, they were victims. To others, their own misfortune was to blame. Abigail Carter continued to defend them with fierce loyalty. One day she told Elias, "I won't let them be forgotten as careless or cursed. They were good people. That's the truth I'll carry." Elias nodded, though quietly he wondered if truth was not many-sided, shaped by grief, by anger, by the needs of the living. Perhaps, he thought, some truths are meant to remain unsettled. Silas Ward remained a figure of division. He walked with his head high, but the suspicion never left him. Every word he spoke in town carried an edge, as though daring someone to accuse him outright. Elias had confronted him, shaken him, exposed enough to tarnish his name, yet without proof the law could do no more. Justice in this case meant drawing close to guilt, but never grasping it fully. And so Fairfield lived on in the shadow of the poisoned stew. The case became folklore, retold in taverns and around firesides, each version bending with the teller's intent. Some swore it was Ward, others believed Martha had made a tragic mistake. Still others claimed darker forces of envy and greed had worked behind the scenes. For Elias, it was not the lack of resolution that haunted him most, but the realization that justice itself was fragile in a world bound by rumor and pride. He had done all he could with the tools he had, yet it was not enough to heal the wound. As snow fell outside his window, Elias whispered into the silence, "Truth is not always the gift we think it is. Sometimes it's a shadow we chase, only to find it fades when we reach for it." The Green family's story lingered as a lesson, not only in death, but in the ways a community can fracture under the weight of fear. Their tragedy became a mirror, reflecting the frailty of trust and the cost of suspicion. And though years would pass, the Green name would forever stir unease in Fairfield, a reminder that even in the heart of a close-knit town, darkness could seep into a pot of stew and change everything. If you want to uncover more forgotten tragedies and mysteries like this one, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story waiting to be told. And if you're ready to continue this journey, click on the video suggested on your screen. It leads to another tale you won't want to miss.